Hi, it's Patrick Hutzel from IntensiveCareHotline.com, where we instantly improve the lives of families of critically ill patients in intensive care, so that you can have peace of mind, real power, real control, and so that you can influence decision making fast, even if you're not a doctor or a nurse in intensive care. In last week's blog, I've shown you how to mute your negative inner dialogue whilst your loved one is critically ill in intensive care. You can check out last week's blog by clicking on the link below this video. In this week's blog, I want to share with you part 1 of how the intensive care team is skillfully playing with your emotions if your loved one is critically ill in intensive care. In today's blog, I want to address a very big issue for families of critically ill patients in intensive care. It's an issue that's mainly flying under the radar for families of critically ill patients in intensive care. It's an issue that families of critically ill patients in intensive care are hardly aware of that it's happening, because they tend to be so far outside of their comfort zone. They are overwhelmed, stressed, anxious, vulnerable, and they often simply don't know what to do and how to deal with this once-in-a-lifetime challenge and frustration. So, in order to become aware of the issue and to really dig down deep into the psychology at play in intensive care, you and your family need to understand that if your critically ill loved one is either very unstable and in a very critical condition, or is in a life-threatening situation, or is in intensive care for long-term treatments and long-term stays, or is having a severe or traumatic head or brain injury, or is threatened with an NFR, not for resuscitation, or DNR, do not resuscitate order, or if your loved one is in a situation where the intensive care team suggests a withdrawal of treatment or a limitation of treatment as being quote-unquote in the best interest of your critically ill loved one, or even if your loved one is approaching their end of life in intensive care, the intensive care team, one way or another, will adjust their behavior, their positioning, the things that they say to you and how they say it. Let me say this again, because it's so important. The minute your critically ill loved one is very unstable and in a very critical condition, or in a life-threatening situation, or is in intensive care for long-term treatments and long-term stays, or is having a severe or traumatic head or brain injury, or if your loved one is threatened with an NFR, not for resuscitation, or DNR, do not resuscitate order, or if your loved one is in a situation where the intensive care team suggests a withdrawal of treatment or a limitation of treatment as being quote-unquote in the best interest of your critically ill loved one, or is approaching their end of life in intensive care, the intensive care team is adjusting their behavior. They are speaking a language that's very guarded, and they are speaking a language that's designed to protect their interests and their interests only. They are not talking to you as if your loved one is in intensive care for a couple of days and it's all going well. Now, if you have found yourself in one of those difficult, challenging and frustrating situations where your loved one is critically ill in intensive care, or is even in a perceived or a real end-of-life situation, if you don't understand that the intensive care team is adjusting their behavior and is skillfully playing with your emotions, you still haven't fully embraced and you haven't fully understood what's happening here, and you haven't fully understood what dynamics are at play and the psychology behind it. I'll give you a few real-world examples so that you understand what I mean by that. Let's say your 62-year-old spouse has been diagnosed with leukemia, and your spouse got admitted to intensive care after they developed pneumonia on the ward after they had some chemotherapy treatment. It looks as if your 62-year-old spouse might require some invasive and mechanical ventilation, basically a tube down in your spouse's lungs in order to help them breathe, as the pneumonia is leading to rapid decline in their respiratory or breathing function. The challenge with leukemia or cancer patients in general in intensive care is often that they are extremely sick patients, and that mechanical ventilation in particular is an uncertain endeavor because leukemia or cancer patients tend not to have many reserves left. However, in this particular instance, you and your children know that your spouse is a fighter, and you and your children are very positive that your spouse will get through it. The intensive care team has already put your spouse on a ventilator, and they are now in an induced coma to keep them comfortable. You are now asked to attend a formal family meeting. The next day, you and your family are asked to meet with the intensive care team. You can also check out some related articles about family meetings in intensive care if you're clicking on the links below this video. In this formal family meeting, the intensive care team is painting a quote-unquote doom and gloom picture, and the senior intensive care consultant is telling you that he believes that a withdrawal of treatment or a limitation of treatment would be quote-unquote in the best interest of your spouse. The senior consultant also mentions that a continuation of treatment would be quote-unquote futile. Check out this related article here. The 5 questions you need to ask when the intensive care team is talking about futility of treatment, withdrawal of life support, or about withdrawal of treatment. You can check out that article by clicking on the link below this video. I can assure you, and I can tell you, that after more than 15 years intensive care nursing experience in 3 different countries, and after I have worked with literally thousands of critically ill patients and their families, that whenever the intensive care team uses the words quote-unquote in the best interest of your critically ill loved one, your alarm bells need to go off and you need to be on high alert. The reality and the fact of the matter is that the dynamics and the psychology at play in such a difficult, challenging and literally life or death situation can be very complex, and if you are not aware of the dynamics and the psychology at play, you, your family and your critically ill loved one are doomed, and you will have no peace of mind, no power, no control and no influence. The fact of the matter is that the minute your critically ill loved one has been admitted to intensive care, and the minute you feel like the intensive care team is trying to save your critically ill loved one's life, that's the minute you start feeling gratitude, and that's the minute when you will feel like you are indebted to the intensive care team. The law of reciprocity always says that whenever somebody is doing something nice for you or is doing you a favor, that you want to return that favor. But in intensive care, in life or death situation, this law of reciprocity is dangerous and it doesn't serve you. I have been in too many situations in intensive care, in family meetings, in perceived end-of-life situations, where the intensive care team skillfully and very shrewdly quote-unquote sold families of critically ill patients in intensive care on a withdrawal of treatment or on a withdrawal of life support as being quote-unquote in the best interest of their critically ill loved one. I can assure you that after more than 15 years intensive care nursing experience in 3 different countries, and after I have worked with literally thousands of critically ill patients and their families that I have seen too many situations where the intensive care team is highly aware, shrewd, and adept at taking advantage of your emotions, and is taking advantage of the tendency of families of critically ill patients in intensive care to quote-unquote give back because they feel indebted and they want to return some of the favors. But you are on dangerous ground because it's the very life, the very health of your critically ill loved one, and it's the very sanity of your family at stake here. And once you've gone down the path, once you have given in to the requests of the intensive care team, it's too late for you and your family to have peace of mind, control, power, and influence. Once you've gone down that path, it's too late for you to do your own research. Once you've gone down that path, it's too late for you and for your family to understand that the decision making of the intensive care team goes way beyond your critically ill loved one's diagnosis and prognosis. Once you've gone down that path, it's too late for you and your family to understand that the intensive care team's positioning of your critically ill loved one's diagnosis and prognosis is directly related to the financial interests of the intensive care team. For example, do they think that they will meet their budget targets by continuing treatment on your critically ill loved one? Also, the intensive care team is considering the competition for scarce, precious and expensive intensive care beds. For example, other patients are waiting and competing for those intensive care beds. Also, the intensive care team is considering their medical research interests. At any given moment, medical research is being conducted in intensive care on real human beings. It could be your critically ill loved one, often without you or your loved one being aware of it, and without you or your critically ill loved one giving verbal or written consent to the medical research being done. The truth of the matter is that medical research is a multi-billion-dollar per year industry and a positioning tool for intensive care units. Also, the things that are happening behind the scenes in intensive care. Because the things happening behind the scenes in intensive care are so powerful that if you don't understand that the dynamics, the power play, the politics, the competing interests, the intrigue, the psychology, and most of all, the hidden agenda of the intensive care team, if you don't know these things, you will literally have a very hard time to have peace of mind, control, power, and influence whilst your loved one is critically ill in intensive care. It'll be very easy for the intensive care team to keep you and your family at arm's length. So, in next week's blog, I'll give you another example in part 2 of how the intensive care team is skillfully playing with your emotions. Tune in for next week for part 2. Until then, make sure that you continue doing your own research and make sure that there is nothing standing in your way of having peace of mind, control, power, and influence, no matter how difficult or challenging the situation you are facing. Remember, peace of mind, control, power, and influence are possible and within your reach, even if your critically ill loved one is dying. So, how can you quickly get peace of mind, control, power, and influence whilst your loved one is critically ill in intensive care? You get to that all-important feeling of peace of mind, control, power, and influence when you download your free Instant Impact Report now by entering your email below. In your free Instant Impact Report, you learn quickly how to get peace of mind, real power, and real control, and how you can influence decision making fast whilst your loved one is critically ill in intensive care. Your free Instant Impact Report gives you in-depth insight that you must know whilst your loved one is critically ill in intensive care. In your free report, you will also discover how to ask the doctors and the nurses the right questions. Discover the many competing interests in intensive care and how your critically ill loved one's treatment may depend on those competing interests. How to eliminate fear, frustration, stress, struggle and vulnerability even if your loved one is dying. You get 5 killer tips and strategies helping you to get on the right path to peace of mind, control, power and influence in your situation. You will get real-world examples that you can easily adapt to your and your critically ill loved one's situation. How to stop being intimidated by the intensive care team and how you will be seen as equals. You will get crucial behind-the-scenes insight so that you know and understand what's really happening in intensive care and how you need to manage doctors and nurses in intensive care, and it's not what you think. Thank you for tuning into this week's blog, and I'll see you again in another update next week. Make sure you also check out our Your Questions Answered section where we answer your questions, or send me an email to support@intensivecarehotline.com with your questions. This is Patrick Hutzel from intensivecarehotline.com, and I'll see you again next week in another update.